In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can cast a light to create shadows and reflections on your 3D objects. Now, a couple of things that we're going to point out before we start. One, you can animate the lights once you put them on there. You can animate them to pass, rotate, pretty much anything you want to do on an X, Y, or Z axis. Number two, it's going to take a while for it to render. The more, because it's a 3D layer, and the more 3D layers that you have, the longer it takes for your file to generate. So let's start by changing our resolution to 1/3 so that this tutorial isn't quite so long. And just scrubbing through, you can see how not only do we have a light layer, and it's this right here, but we've animated it so that it passes over and lights the entire object. After you have your 3D layers, there's going to be two things that you're going to want to do. One, you're going to probably want to create a third 3D layer. That's, I guess, a wall is the best way to describe it. Something that is behind your graphics so that when the light hits, it can cast a shadow onto it. Because this has a bevel to it, you can see that it's casting a shadow onto this light green area. Not necessarily on the black because the shadow is black. But we have a white wall behind us that allows us to cast not only this shadow, but a little bit of reflection to make the wall look plastic, shiny, or even metallic. So let's look at this from the top so that you can see. There's our top layer, which is the words, the letters. Here's our back layer, which is our back of the logo, and then here's our wall. The wall doesn't have a 3D extrusion on it or anything. It can, but doesn't necessarily need it because all its purpose is to rest behind the logo far enough so that you can see shadows when it's cast by the light. So let's start with assuming we've created a wall and we brought our logo in. We've extruded our logo and set any kind of bevels or rotations that we want to it. So now we're ready to cast our light. Without the light, it looks simply like this. To create light, or a light source, you're going to probably want to put it above everything so that it shines over it. So you'll go to Layer, New, Light. This dialog box will pop up talking about the different things that you can have with the light layer. You have spot, point, ambient, parallel, spot being the default. Spot tends to be an overall kind of light. Ambient as well, but ambient is a softer light. And to kind of show you what we have going on here, we've set for this demo the light to be point. So let's go back and create our light layer. Layer, New, Light. Spot lights tend to blow out a lot of what you're projecting them on unless you animate their distance away, because the closer they get, the brighter these get and the hotter they get, blowing out a lot of the color. You'll know it when you see it. I tend to use point lights because they tend to be a little softer, but in the end, I encourage you just to experiment with what you like to see what works best for your project, but be aware you may want the preview set low until you're actually ready to start rendering. You can change the color of the light. Of course, by default, they're usually white, but depending on the project, you may want to project more of a color onto this. The intensity is how bright it's going to be. Fall off is the amount of light as it disappears from the subject. The standard settings are pretty much fine. How far the light falls off, radius. Of course, you're going to want it to cast shadows because that's the whole point. And you can even preview your light. But we're just going to hit OK and just create our light. And there's our standard light. When I open up the light layer, you'll see that I have transform, where I can transform its position. But more importantly, I've got the light layers. I can adjust intensity. And this is what I was talking about blowing out. It tends to be really, really intense and bright. But by default, it starts off at 100%, but you can increase that. More importantly to note is that when you cast your light layers, you're going to want to then adjust your 3D layers behind it, particularly under the material options. You're going to want to make sure that it accepts shadows. If you don't have this turned on, then it's not going to cast the shadows like you see here on the screen. So make sure that after you've set your light and adjusted your light, that you then go into your 3D layers and change under geometry options, or rather material options, that you want to turn cast shadows on. And this is where you can then adjust the shadows, particularly reflections, how hard, how soft, how shiny. Basically what happens to the surface when the light passes over it. So if you turn on your light layer and you notice that it's not casting a shadow, it means that you haven't turned on in the material options on your other 3D layers light transmission, accepts shadows, accepts lights. Those have to be turned on in order for it to work. And this is how we create light layers in Adobe After Effects.